On July 12th, United States Central Command completed a wave of strikes against dozens of targets scattered across Iran's southern coastline, and buried inside that routine-sounding announcement was a single sentence that quietly marked a genuine first in the history of American warfare. CENTCOM forces struck Iranian military air defense systems, coastal radar sites, missile and drone capabilities, and small boats using fighter aircraft, naval vessels, one-way attack aerial drones, and, for the very first time, one-way attack sea drones. Read that again. Not aerial drones alone, not missiles fired from ships, but actual unmanned surface vessels, armed with warheads, driven directly into Iranian coastal targets and detonated on impact, deployed in real combat for the first time in American military history. That's not a minor footnote in a months-long air campaign. That's a new category of weapon making its combat debut, specifically to hunt down the hidden coves, coastal bunkers, and small boat nests Iran has spent years building along its southern shoreline. So, let's break down exactly what these coastal hideouts are, why the United States needed an entirely new class of weapon to go after them, and how this single tactical shift fits into the much larger campaign that's been grinding down Iran's ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz for months. A campaign that's already reshaped how naval warfare against dispersed coastal threats gets fought going forward. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand what Iran actually built along its coastline over the past 2 decades, because it wasn't a conventional navy in any traditional sense. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps invested heavily in what's often called an asymmetric maritime strategy, built around dispersing enormous numbers of small, fast, cheap patrol boats into hidden coves, inlets, and improvised shelters carved into the rocky coastline and the string of islands controlling the Strait of Hormuz. Estimates put Iran's fleet of these small attack craft at more than 1,000 vessels before this current phase of the war even began, scattered deliberately across locations that are extraordinarily difficult to target with conventional airstrikes, precisely because they're small, numerous, and tucked into terrain that doesn't show up clearly on radar or satellite imagery the way a proper naval base would, forcing anyone hunting them to rely on persistent, adaptive methods rather than a single sweeping strike. Add to that hardened coastal missile batteries, radar installations built into hillsides, and drone launch sites positioned specifically to threaten commercial shipping transiting the strait, and you get exactly what the title refers to as coastal hideouts, a sprawling, deliberately dispersed network designed to survive exactly the kind of large-scale airstrikes the United States has been running against Iran for months. The islands themselves read like a list of names that have become painfully familiar to anyone following this war closely. Keshem Island, the largest island in the Persian Gulf, sitting directly astride the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. Kish Island, Abu Musa, Greater Tumb, all positioned to give Iran overlapping fields of coverage across the narrowest, most critical stretch of the entire waterway. Coastal towns like Sirik, Bandar Abbas, Jask, and Kanarak round out the mainland side of this network, each hosting some combination of radar sites, missile storage, drone facilities, or small boat pens built specifically to blend into the surrounding terrain. This is the target set that's been hit, night after night, for months. And it's worth walking through exactly how that campaign escalated to understand why deploying an entirely new weapon system against it became necessary. Go back to early July, when Iran struck the Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy after the IRGC Navy declared the strait closed and claimed it had fired warning shots at a vessel attempting to cross an unauthorized route. The attack caused heavy damage to the ship's engine room, forcing the crew, including 11 Indian nationals, to abandon ship in a lifeboat, with one crew member remaining missing for a period before being accounted for. On July 7th, CENTCOM responded with a strike on more than 80 separate targets in a single operation, hitting Iranian air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and more than 60 IRGC small boats operating in and around the strait, with explosions reported around Sirik, Bandar Abbas, and Keshem Island. That's an extraordinary number of targets to service in one coordinated strike, and it tells you the campaign had already shifted from occasional retaliatory hits toward a genuinely systematic effort to dismantle Iran's coastal network piece by piece. Just days later, on July 11th, the United States hit Iranian military bases again, with Fars news agency reporting 10 explosions in Sirik and 4 more on Keshem Island, while a U.S. official told Axios the strikes that particular day were 4 or 5 times bigger in scope and power than the strikes conducted just 10 days earlier. Iranian state media cited a military spokesperson warning that Iran would retaliate against the origin point of any future strikes, declaring that all American bases in the region were legitimate targets for Iranian military drones. Then came July 12th and 13th when CENTCOM launched what officials described as the 3rd consecutive night of strikes at that point in this specific escalation, explicitly stating the operation was targeting Iranian coastal defense systems, missile and drone sites, and maritime capabilities, And it was during this exact stretch that the one-way attack sea drones made their combat debut alongside the aerial drones that had already become a fixture of this campaign. It's worth walking through a few more specific incidents from this stretch of the war, because they illustrate just how consistently these coastal hideouts have been the flashpoint driving every fresh round of American strikes. The GFS Galaxy incident wasn't an isolated event either. It came after the IRGC had already fired on the Gambia-flagged Leon Star back on May 29th, prompting an American strike in response, which Iran then cited as its own justification for later hitting the Ever Lovely, a Singapore-flagged container ship attacked southeast of Tahit, Oman, on June 25th. That attack was significant enough that the International Maritime Organization actually paused a planned evacuation of roughly 11,000 sailors from the strait, even though the Ever Lovely itself wasn't part of that evacuation framework. CENTCOM's response the following day, June 26th, specifically targeted infrastructure linked to missile and drone capabilities, along with coastal radar systems, including sites on Keshem Island, the exact same location that keeps appearing over and over throughout this entire campaign as one of the most heavily defended and most heavily targeted coastal hideout complexes in the entire theater. That back and forth rhythm, an attack on shipping followed within a day or two by a retaliatory strike specifically aimed at the coastal network Iran used to launch that attack, has repeated itself so many times throughout this war that it's become almost a predictable cadence. And it's exactly that cadence the debut of one-way attack sea drones was designed to break, by making it possible to hunt these positions preemptively and persistently, rather than simply reacting after each new attack on commercial shipping. There's also a financial dimension to this coastal campaign that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Iran's use of small boats, hidden missile batteries, and coastal radar to threaten shipping through the strait has never been about winning a conventional military confrontation. It's been about imposing economic pain broadly enough to force a negotiated outcome favorable to Tehran. Every tanker damaged, every shipping company forced to reroute or pay skyrocketing insurance premiums. Every day the Strait of Hormuz operates below its normal capacity, translates directly into pressure on global oil markets and, by extension, pressure on the political leadership of every country dependent on that oil. That's precisely why the United States has treated this coastal hideout network as such a high priority target set, even while simultaneously running a broader campaign against Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile production, and its command infrastructure further inland. A degraded nuclear program matters enormously for long-term regional security. But a functioning coastal harassment network is what's actually driving day-to-day oil price volatility and day-to-day disruption to global shipping right now, which makes it, in a very real sense, the most economically urgent target set in the entire war, and explains why an entirely new weapons category got fast-tracked into combat specifically to go after it, rather than being reserved for some later, lower priority phase of the conflict. A prioritization that speaks volumes about how military planners are actually weighing the various fronts of this war against each other behind closed doors. Now, let's actually talk about what a one-way attack sea drone is, because understanding the mechanics of this weapon explains exactly why it represents such a significant tactical shift against precisely the kind of hidden coastal network Iran built. Think of it as the maritime equivalent of the loitering munitions and kamikaze drones that have become such a defining feature of modern warfare in Ukraine, except built to operate on the water instead of in the air. These are unmanned surface vessels, essentially armed boats with no crew aboard, guided either autonomously or remotely toward a target, carrying an explosive payload and designed to detonate on impact rather than returning to base. That one-way design is exactly what makes them so effective against the kind of target set Iran built along its coastline. A conventional airstrike, even a precision-guided one, still requires identifying a target clearly enough from altitude to commit an expensive munition and risk exposing an aircraft to any surviving air defense in the area. A one-way attack sea drone can be sent directly into a shallow cove, nosed right up against a hidden boat pen or coastal bunker entrance that's specifically built into terrain designed to defeat aerial targeting, and detonate at essentially point-blank range against a target that might never have been cleanly identifiable from the air in the first place. It's a weapon built specifically to solve the exact problem Iran's dispersed, hidden coastal network was designed to create. To really appreciate how significant this shift is, it helps to look at the precedent Ukraine already set in a completely different theater. Ukraine's naval drone program, built around unmanned surface vessels like the Sea Baby and the Magura series, became one of the most consequential developments of the entire Russia-Ukraine war, specifically because Ukraine has no meaningful conventional navy of its own, and yet those relatively small, inexpensive drone boats managed to sink or damage a significant portion of Russia's Black Sea fleet, forcing Russian warships to relocate away from Sevastopol entirely, and effectively neutralizing Russia's naval dominance in the western Black Sea, without Ukraine ever needing to build a single traditional warship. That precedent matters enormously here because it proved, in real combat conditions against a much larger conventional navy, that unmanned surface vessels aren't just a theoretical concept or a niche capability. They're a genuinely battlefield-proven category of weapon capable of achieving strategic effects against targets that would otherwise require enormous conventional naval resources to threaten. The United States clearly took note of that precedent, and applying the same underlying concept against Iran's coastal hideout network represents the first time a major conventional power, with its own enormous navy, has folded this exact category of weapon into its own combat operations, rather than leaving it as a tool primarily associated with smaller, less conventionally powerful militaries fighting from a position of relative weakness. It's also worth understanding the guidance and targeting side of how these systems actually operate, because that's what separates a one-way attack sea drone from something as simple as a remote-controlled boat packed with explosives. These platforms typically combine GPS navigation for the open water transit phase with some combination of onboard cameras, infrared sensors, or radar guidance for final approach, allowing an operator, or in more advanced configurations, an autonomous targeting system to identify and confirm a specific target, whether that's a hidden boat pen, a coastal radar installation, or a docked patrol craft, before committing to the final attack run. That level of precision matters enormously when you're operating against targets deliberately concealed inside civilian-adjacent coastal terrain, because it allows for far more selective targeting than a broader area strike would provide, reducing the kind of collateral damage that becomes almost unavoidable when you're trying to flush out dispersed military assets hidden among fishing villages and coastal settlements. That's not a guarantee against mistakes, and Iranian claims about strikes hitting residential structures near military positions on Keshem Island are a reminder of exactly how difficult that balance remains, even with more precise weapon systems involved. But it does represent a meaningful improvement over the alternative of either ignoring these hidden coastal positions entirely or hitting them with far less discriminating firepower. There's also a cost and risk calculation buried in this decision that matters enormously for a campaign that's already run for months. Every fighter jet sortie against a coastal target puts a pilot at risk, however degraded Iran's air defenses have become after months of sustained suppression strikes. Every naval vessel that has to get close enough to strike a shallow coastal position puts a crewed warship within range of exactly the kind of small boat swarm attacks and coastal missile fire that Iran has used throughout this war. A one-way attack sea drone removes both of those risks entirely. No pilot in the cockpit, no sailors aboard the vessel actually approaching the target. If Iran manages to shoot one down or disable it with coastal defenses, the cost to the United States is a relatively inexpensive unmanned platform rather than a multi-million-dollar aircraft, or far more importantly, a human life. That calculus becomes especially significant when you're trying to systematically clear out dozens or even hundreds of small, dispersed hideouts along an extended coastline, a mission that would otherwise require an enormous number of high-risk sorties to accomplish through conventional means alone. This is also, notably, not the only new weapon system that's made its combat debut against this exact target set during this specific stretch of the war. Alongside the sea drones, CENTCOM's July strikes also involved one-way attack aerial drones operating in coordination with traditional fighter aircraft and naval vessels, creating a genuinely layered strike package where manned aircraft, guided missiles, aerial kamikaze drones, and now naval kamikaze drones are all being used simultaneously against the same coastal network. That kind of multi-domain saturation is exactly what you need to actually crack open a target set built specifically around dispersal and concealment, because no single weapon system can cover every possible hiding spot along hundreds of kilometers of coastline and dozens of islands. But a combination of systems, each suited to a different piece of that puzzle, dramatically increases the odds that even the most carefully hidden position eventually gets found and destroyed. And the pace of this campaign has been genuinely relentless. Earlier in the war, back in March, CENTCOM had already released footage showing thermal imaging strikes on partly concealed Iranian ballistic missile launchers hidden under bridges, trees, bunkers, and inside urban areas, with officials stating at the time that American and Israeli forces had destroyed more than 300 mobile launchers, a meaningful dent in Iran's estimated 3,000 missile arsenal even that early in the conflict. CENTCOM's commander at the time described the remaining threats as lingering rather than eliminated, acknowledging that Iran's use of mobile launchers for indiscriminate strikes required a sustained hunter mission using drones and satellites rather than a single decisive strike. That same logic, sustained, layered, multi-domain hunting rather than one big knockout blow, is exactly what's been applied to the coastal hideout network in the months since, culminating in the debut of naval attack drones, specifically because the mobile, dispersed nature of Iran's coastal assets required exactly the kind of persistent, adaptable hunting capability that a purely aerial campaign alone couldn't fully deliver. Iran's response to all of this has followed a consistent pattern throughout the war. retaliating against Gulf partner nations and commercial shipping whenever its own coastal capabilities take a hit. Following the July strikes, Kuwait's armed forces announced they were actively combating hostile aerial targets, describing missile and drone threats intercepted within their own airspace. Jordan's military reported intercepting 8 Iranian missiles during this same general window. Iran's army spokesman warned publicly that attacks would spread to new areas if the United States continued its campaign, adding that a significant portion of the country's armed forces capabilities had not yet been demonstrated, a statement clearly designed to project remaining strength even as its coastal network kept absorbing hit after hit. Whether that claim reflects genuine reserve capacity or simply wartime bravado is difficult to verify independently, but it's worth noting that Iran has made similar claims throughout this conflict, some verified and some, like an earlier claim of striking American hideouts in Dubai housing more than 500 troops, flatly denied by CENTCOM after Iranian state media pushed the story without any supporting evidence. The most recent escalation in this specific thread came just days ago, when CENTCOM confirmed it had struck dozens of additional IRGC targets, including military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance and defense sites, and maritime capabilities, following what officials described as an attempted Iranian attack against American forces earlier that same week. President Trump had publicly pledged to hit Iran very hard in response, telling reporters it was, in his words, our turn. Iranian state broadcaster IREB published photos and video from Keshem Island, claiming search and rescue operations were underway, after American missiles struck what Iranian media described as a residential structure in the area, a claim that, like many Iranian assertions throughout this war, arrived without independent verification, but underscores just how tightly packed some of these coastal military positions have become with the surrounding civilian population, a reality that makes precision targeting in these dense coastal zones genuinely difficult, regardless of how sophisticated the weapon system delivering the strike happens to be. It's also worth pausing on the human cost woven through every one of these coastal incidents, because it's easy to get lost in the technical details of drone platforms and strike statistics and lose sight of the fact that real crews are caught in the middle of this every single time. A hidden coastal position launches an attack on a passing vessel. The GFS Galaxy incident left a crew member missing for a period after the ship's crew, including 11 Indian nationals, was forced to abandon ship in a lifeboat following heavy damage to the engine room, a reminder that every time Iran's coastal network manages to strike a commercial vessel, ordinary merchant sailors with no stake in this geopolitical conflict are the ones facing genuine, immediate danger. That's precisely the calculation driving the urgency behind clearing out this coastal hideout network as quickly and as thoroughly as possible, because every additional hidden boat pen or concealed missile battery that survives another week represents another opportunity for exactly that kind of incident to repeat itself against some other merchant crew transiting waters that are supposed to remain open under international law. The regional partner response throughout this campaign also deserves more attention than it typically gets, because Iran's coastal hideouts haven't just been threatening American and Israeli interests. They've been forcing an entire coalition of Gulf nations into active air defense operations on a near-continuous basis. Kuwait's armed forces have repeatedly had to intercept missile and drone threats entering their own airspace as fallout from this campaign, and Jordan's military intercepted a wave of 8 Iranian missiles during just one specific window of retaliation. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman have all been drawn into intercepting Iranian counterattacks at various points throughout this war as well, meaning the coastal hideout network isn't just a bilateral American-Iranian problem. It's a persistent regional security burden that every neighboring country with any exposure to Iranian retaliation has had to help absorb, whether or not they have any direct stake in why the strikes against those coastal positions happened in the first place. That regional exposure is exactly why systematically eliminating Iran's coastal hideout network carries strategic value that extends well beyond simply protecting shipping through the strait itself. Every hidden position taken offline is one less potential launch point for a retaliatory strike that some entirely separate Gulf nation ends up having to intercept over its own cities. It's worth stepping back and thinking about why the United States has been so specifically focused on this coastal hideout network rather than simply continuing to pursue Iran's larger strategic assets further inland. The answer comes down to exactly what these hideouts enable Iran to do. Every hidden boat pen, every concealed coastal missile battery, every radar site built into a hillside overlooking the strait exists for one operational purpose: giving Iran the ability to threaten, harass, or directly attack commercial shipping, transiting one of the most economically vital waterways on the planet. You can degrade Iran's nuclear infrastructure, you can destroy its ballistic missile production facilities, you can dismantle its command and control networks, but as long as that dispersed coastal network survives, Iran retains the ability to send a handful of fast boats out from a hidden cove to fire on a tanker, or launch a drone from a concealed coastal site toward a passing vessel using assets small and dispersed enough that a single major strike can never fully eliminate the threat. That's exactly the kind of persistent, low-cost, asymmetric capability that keeps a much larger and more powerful adversary from ever fully closing the book on a conflict. And it's exactly why systematically hunting down and destroying that network, hideout by hideout, cove by cove, using every available weapon system, including a brand new class of naval attack drone, has become such a central pillar of this entire campaign. There's a broader strategic lesson here too, one that extends well beyond this specific war. The debut of one-way attack sea drones in actual combat represents a genuine inflection point in how naval warfare against dispersed asymmetric coastal threats gets conducted going forward. Ukraine has already demonstrated in its own war against Russia's Black Sea Fleet just how effective relatively cheap unmanned surface vessels can be against much larger, more expensive conventional naval assets, forcing Russia to withdraw major warships from parts of the Black Sea entirely, rather than risk losing them to drone boats costing a tiny fraction of the vessels they're threatening. What's happening along Iran's coastline right now represents the American military applying a similar concept, but flipped, using cheap, expendable naval drones not against large enemy warships, but against the exact kind of small, dispersed, hidden targets that have historically been the hardest thing for a conventional navy to fully eliminate. If this approach proves as effective against Iran's coastal network as early reporting suggests, you can reasonably expect this same weapons category to become a standard tool in any future conflict involving an adversary that relies on exactly this kind of asymmetric, dispersed coastal defense strategy, because the fundamental problem these drones solve, finding and destroying small, hidden mobile targets along an extended coastline without risking crewed vessels or aircraft, isn't unique to Iran. It's a challenge that shows up anywhere a smaller power tries to offset a larger adversary's conventional advantage through dispersal and concealment rather than direct confrontation. Consider also what this specific tactical shift does to the broader economics of this entire war. Every one of Iran's small boats, every hidden missile battery, every concealed radar site represents a genuine investment of resources built up over years, specifically because Iran assumed these dispersed positions would be difficult and costly for any adversary to fully clear out. A campaign that can now hunt those positions using relatively inexpensive unmanned platforms instead of expensive manned sorties fundamentally breaks that assumption. Iran built an asymmetric strategy specifically designed to make the cost of eliminating it disproportionately high for whoever tried, and the introduction of one-way attack sea drones directly attacks that cost calculation, turning what was supposed to be an expensive, risky hunting mission into something considerably more sustainable to carry out night after night for as long as the campaign requires. That shift in the underlying economics of this specific fight matters just as much as the tactical results of any single strike, because a war of attrition against a dispersed target network is ultimately decided by which side can sustain the cost of that attrition longer. And every dollar the United States saves by using an inexpensive drone instead of risking an expensive aircraft or crewed vessel is a dollar that tilts that particular equation further in America's favor. None of this means Iran's coastal network has been fully eliminated, and it's worth being honest about that. Iran built this system with dispersal and redundancy specifically in mind, and months of sustained strikes, however systematic and however innovative the weapon systems involved, have degraded rather than completely destroyed that capability. Iran's own statements throughout this war, however unreliable some individual claims have proven to be, consistently emphasize that a significant portion of the country's remaining military capability has not yet been demonstrated. And whether that's genuine reserve strength or simply rhetorical posturing, the honest assessment has to acknowledge that a fleet that reportedly numbered over 1,000 small boats before this war began isn't going to be reduced to zero through any single strike or even any single new weapons category, no matter how effective. What's changed is the trajectory. Iran's coastal hideouts, once considered one of the most difficult target sets in this entire conflict precisely because of how well they were designed to survive conventional strikes, are now being hunted using a weapon specifically built to defeat exactly that kind of concealment. And every additional night this campaign continues represents another opportunity to further erode a network that Iran spent decades building under the assumption it would remain functionally untouchable. There's one more piece of this worth understanding before wrapping up, because it speaks directly to how this campaign is likely to evolve from here. Weapon systems that debut in combat rarely stay static once they've proven effective. They get refined, produced in greater numbers, and integrated more deeply into standard operating doctrine. If the one-way attack sea drones deployed against Iran's coastal hideouts in July perform the way early indications suggest, expect their role in this specific campaign to expand rather than remain a one-time novelty, potentially scaling from supplementary strikes alongside conventional aircraft toward a genuinely primary tool for clearing contested coastal terrain. That kind of scaling matters enormously for how quickly the remaining portions of Iran's dispersed network can realistically be neutralized, because a weapon system used sparingly as a proof of concept produces very different results than the same system deployed at scale, night after night, across every remaining hidden cove and boat pen still standing along that coastline. And every indication from this specific stretch of the war suggests that scaling up is exactly the direction this campaign is now headed. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think this shift toward one-way attack sea drones represents the beginning of a genuinely new standard in how conflicts like this get fought against dispersed coastal threats? Or do you think Iran's sheer number of hidden positions means this campaign will keep grinding on for months without ever fully closing that gap? Drop your take in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of question where the technical details actually matter. And I'd genuinely like to hear how people are reading the trajectory of this specific front compared to everything else happening in this war, from the blockade to the nuclear negotiations to everything else competing for attention in a conflict that keeps producing new fronts faster than any single headline can capture. If this breakdown helped you understand why a single sentence buried in a CENTCOM statement about coastal hideouts actually represents a genuine first in military history, go ahead and hit like on this one. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed, source-grounded analysis reach more people trying to follow the technical and strategic side of this war rather than just the headline explosions everyone else is already covering. Since the real story here was easy to miss entirely if you weren't reading past the first line of the announcement. Subscribing means you'll be here the moment the next new weapon system makes its combat debut in this campaign, and given how quickly this specific front has been evolving, from mobile missile launcher hunts back in March to naval kamikaze drones by July, that next escalation could arrive faster than anyone expects, and you'll want to have the full technical context ready when it does. And if you know anyone who's been following this war but hasn't heard about what's actually happening along Iran's coastline specifically, share this with them, because this thread, quieter than the headlines about carrier deployments and nuclear sites, might end up being one of the most technically significant developments to come out of this entire conflict. One that future militaries studying this war will likely point back to as the moment naval drone warfare stopped being a niche Ukrainian innovation and became a standard tool in the American arsenal. Thanks for watching all the way through. Stay close to this one, because a military that just debuted an entirely new category of weapon in actual combat is not going to stop there. And whatever comes next along this coastline is going to be worth watching closely, especially as the number of these platforms deployed each night continues to climb and Iran's remaining hidden positions run out of places left to hide.